everyone, we are teammate, and as a lecture presentation, we will be talking about motion transformation, more specifically motion style transfer and motion retargeting. First is about motion style transfer, but before diving right into it, I'll talk about image style transfer for better understanding. Most of the explanations of image style transfer will be based on CVPR 2016 paper, Image Style Transfer Using Convolutional Neural Networks. Image style transfer is a technique for generating an image that preserves the content of the original image while applying the visual style of another. Three images below shows an example of style transfer. Left is the content image and the other two is created by applying specific style onto that content image. This is done with a pre-trained CNN model. CNN model, or a convolutional neural networks model, is a type of deep learning architecture modeled after the human visual cortex. It uses convolutional operations to preserve the spatial information of images and is known for good performance in image classification tasks. In this paper, this pre-trained CNN model is used to recreate a target image. Instead of updating the weights, they directly change the pixels of the image. Here, as you can see in the image below, they start from the very first random noise image. From the initial image, loss value between the target image is calculated and the pixels are updated to decrease loss value. By repeating this process, target image can be recreated. In order to conduct image style transfer, loss between both the content image and style image is considered collectively. In this case, since image is eventually composed of just rows and columns, it is considered as a single vector. Now, let's go down a little bit more. This is the function for loss value between the created image and the content image. F and P are the feature map, each computed by inserting the created image and the content image to a specific layer of pre-trained CNN model mentioned before. So, as you can see, content loss is calculated simply by comparing the images without any other consideration. On the other hand, style loss considers the correlation of different features, and by correlation we mean the similarity between different features achieved by computing linear products of activation values. The computed values comes together to compose a gram matrix, which is the representation of a style. Then, just like the content loss, it compares the gram matrix of the created image and the style image, multiplies the weight to apply importance to the different layers, and achieves the style loss. So the overall process looks like this. Content loss compares the content image and the created image directly, while style loss computes the gram matrices by comparing the correlation of features of different layers, and then compare the gram matrix. These content loss and style loss are considered collectively to create an image with specific content and style. Motion style transfer works in a similar way, but with motions represented by joint positions and joint rotations in each frame. By style in motion here, we mean characteristics of motion such as proud, angry, happy, or heavy. Most of the explanations of motion style transfer will be based on a paper on paired motion style transfer from video to animation. According to the paper, its network, similar to image style transfer, encodes motions into two latent codes: content and style code. Content code inferred by joint rotation is decoded into the output motion by several temporal convolutional layers, resulting in a set of temporal signals that determine the joint rotations in a high-dimensional feature space. The style code inferred by joint position modifies deep features by adaptive instance normalization, preserving the content of the original motion. These codes are sent to decoder F, which consists of adaptive instance normalization and convolutional layers. The content code is decoded into the output motion through temporal convolutional layers. The style code manipulates each channel of deep layers through adaptive instance normalization layer, which performs a fine transformation which is temporarily invariant to modify means and variance. This again works like the gram matrix mentioned before. This approach considers means and variance of feature space as a style. So again simply treats this mean and variance to a desired value to get a desired style. The loss value for content consistency and multi-style adversarial are computed then for evaluation.
Next, I will briefly talk about motion retargeting techniques. Motion retargeting is in the area of computer animation. It simply means transferring motion from one hierarchy of items to another. For example, we can transfer a human's motion to another hierarchy of objects such as dog's motion. By applying this motion retargeting, we don't have to repeat making same motions with different objects. We can easily reuse the existing motion to other objects, so it will be very efficient. In motion retargeting, we aim to preserve as many of the desirable properties of original motion as possible. For instance, if we want to retarget swing dancing humans to swing dancing crocodiles, then we have to mainly preserve some specific features of swing dancing. So before talking about motion retargeting technique, it is better to know about components of animation object model first. Animation object model consists of skeletons and meshes, which we usually know as skin. Skeleton bone structure is usually a tree structure, or some cases like robots, direct acyclic graph is used too. As you can see in the picture, pelvis, which we know as 골반, is often used as root node, and other joints which we know as 관절 are child nodes of the root. This is a simple process of making animation. When we make animations, first we make a 3D model. Next, we make bone or skeletal structure of the model. Then we do a process called skinning or called vertex blending. As human skin has elasticity, if one vertex of mesh, which is component of skin, correspond to one bone, then unnatural movement happens. For instance, skin will be teared up. Therefore, each bone assigns weights to each vertex consisting meshes to implement elasticity of skin. Finally, we make motions and retargeting if needed. You can retarget motions in Unity or Unreal by your own. Let's go down to motion retargeting. I'll introduce you the traditional method of motion retargeting. This paper is actually a first paper that introduced motion retargeting problem by Michael Glyer in SIGGRAPH 1998. It deals with same bone structures but having different lengths of each bones and limbs. The author add constraints and optimize space-time constraints solver. I will explain more about constraints. So what is constraint? It is actually introduced in mathematics, meaning a specific condition that we have while solving optimization problems. In this paper, constraints are required basic features of the motion. For example, a walking motion requires character's foot to touch the floor. Also, the hands must remain the correct distance apart while carrying a box. When we use knife motion retargeting, which is just a mapping of skeletal structures that I introduced, this simple retargeting violates some constraints. For example, when we retarget a motion of big person to a small size of character, motion can skate along horizontally above the floor like flying. So to solve this, inverse kinematics is often used. Inverse kinematics is positioning end effectors of articulated figures in individual frame of animation. End effectors are end part of body such as hand, foot, etc. For example, if you want to animate person carrying a box, first we set the position of hand, which is end effector, to the box, and then get the corresponding angles of joints. On the other hand, forward kinematics is about using joints angles as input and then get end effector's coordinate as output. It is totally opposite way of inverse kinematics. However, this inverse kinematics solver considers each frame independently, so undesirable motion happens. Since it is independent, it does not care about continuity of frames. For example, foot should be fixed to floor at I plus 1's frame, but at ith frame, It doesn't know about it since frame is independent. So foot seems to snap to new location, which means very haste and fast motion. This seems very unnatural and sudden motion, which we call high frequency jerkiness. As you can see in the picture, we want to animate walking character, but the frames are not connected smoothly and seem to be very sudden. So it is important to preserve this high frequency content of motion. This means that the high frequency does not have to be removed. For instance, if we want to animate Karate Master's kick, it will have very fast, high frequency motion, so we have to preserve it. So this per frame approach seems not good. So the author introduced the space-time constraints. These space-time constraints consider a relationship among multiple frames. After establishing constraints, we minimize changes of original motion to new motion. More mathematically, there is a whole motion MT and constraints are FMT, which can be equality or inequality problem. Then we minimize objective function Gm, which compares motion with original motion M0T. This approach looks at the entire motion. But actually in real life, constraints and objective functions are hard to solve mathematically since it is too complex. So the author simplified them by bringing in new motion representations such as motion displacement maps, dealing with preserving high frequency problem by adopting cubic B-splines with control point spacing, and also finding good start point, which means initial estimation of solution. These are quite low level to explain in this short lecture, so if you're interested in those things, I recommend you to read this paper. Actually, the key point is whether using inverse kinematics that is widely used before. The author defines specific constraints called space-time constraints and an objective function to optimize it. So this process is connected and can be more developed by deep learning based method of motion retargeting. I'll briefly tell you about a famous paper that introduced this method. The paper named Skeleton Aware Networks for Deep Motion Retargeting by Kefir Aberman in SIGGRAPH 2020 deals with different structures of characters. As I mentioned in the first paper, it only deals with same structure with different limbs lengths. This paper solves problem with retargeting motions of topologically different bone structures. It applies deep motion representation for skeletons. Also, the deep neural network is skeleton aware, which means that it learns hierarchy and joint adjacency. As you can see in the picture, the skeletal convolution and pooling techniques are used. Shallow layers learn local low-level correlations between joint rotations, and deep layers learn higher-level correlation between body parts like the way CNN convolutional neural network works. Also, the authors treat retargeting problem as multimodal translation between unpaired domains. This means that each domain has different motions that share the topologically same skeletal structure. So in conclusion, motion retargeting is not only a topic of computer animation and computer graphics. It is widely discovered and has a lot been a research topic in robotics too, since the smoothness of motions of these robots could be very important. Lastly, we prepared 2 questions for quiz. This is the quiz link and it will be easy enough if you followed our lecture well. These are our references. And this is the end of our lecture, and I hope you better understand the contents of motion style transfer and motion retargeting. Thank you for listening.